and practicing a critical feminist consciousness. As Palestinian feminist scholar Sarah Ahmoud reflects, testaments of love provide intimate kinship and solidarity, demonstrate care across borders and boundaries, they bear witness, allow for expressions of grief and possibilities towards communal healing and liberation. As several parts of the globe face war and genocidal duress, expressions of decolonial love and life affirming practice serve as a powerful form of resistance and refusal. The topic of our conversation today, Towards Life, Liberation, and Light, locating a Sufi feminism in Palestine, gives an intimate glimpse of a mystical community in the occupied West Bank and their unique insights on healing and liberation. This community in Palestine is led by spiritual teacher Mataz Maraka and has a female identifying majority. Living under occupation and oppression, they nonetheless manifest a framework for healing and liberation within that also radiates into the world. I'd like to begin with a short story for this lecture, as several Sufi and mystical pedagogies often do. Next slide, please, Jeremy. Mataz Maraka, spiritual teacher in Hebron in the occupied West Bank, travels to the old city of Hebron on a Saturday morning, the morning after Palestinian protesters resist the occupation forces every Friday. Maraka gathers detonated tear gas grenades, common weapons of war used against Palestinian bodies. On his way to work, he also picks flowers along the way or buys them from a local floral shop. After retrieving some of these detonated tools of war, Maraka clears them of debris and prepares them for an entirely different reality. He fills them with soil and plants flowers in them, altering these weapons of war into a vessel for the flower to breathe new life into. This act is one I will use as metaphor to distill some of Maraka's central teachings, their Sufi feminist registers, and their resonances with Palestinian feminist aspirations. Next slide, Jeremy. The subject of this lecture speaks to two scholarly inquiries, Sufi feminist and Palestinian feminist modes of analysis. Recent research in Sufism often notes its patriarchal and hierarchical underpinnings and the need to retrieve more feminist-oriented readings. Sadia Sheikh, a pioneer in Sufi feminist thought, notes that, quote, patriarchal theologies often hold an excessive focus on elements of God's distance and transcendence, and also often denigrate materiality and the body, and by extension, women who are identified primarily with bodily principle, unquote. Sheikh notes the need for a necessary corrective that subvert patriarchal theologies and that affirm the material, the bodily, and the earthly. Similarly, recent scholarship from Zahra Ayubi highlights how Islamic theologies often privilege and assume male subjectivity. Ayubi's scholarship in turn identifies a need to challenge these normative assumptions within Islamic ethics literature, which arguably reify the male elite as the universal self. Finally, Rose Dayton Muhammad notes the harm certain traditional Sufi pedagogies pose to self and body and may reinforce or disregard one's trauma or subjugation to structures of oppression. In concert, these scholars illuminate a need to uncover feminist-oriented readings from perspectives that decenter the normative male elite self, that privilege God's immanence and positive affirmations of the earth, body, and women, and convey reimagined Sufi teachings and pedagogies to account for potential harm. Next slide. Along similar lines, recent research in Palestinian feminism calls for a decolonial praxis of love and the need to foreground life-affirming and life-making practices as a method of resistance. Ahmoud defines a praxis of decolonial love as a process that, quote, uplifts Palestinian life without reproducing patriarchal structures of colonial violence and disposability, that requires boldly affirming the power and creativity of our life force that we have always possessed and cultivated as Indigenous women, the power we have always wielded, unquote. Similarly, the Palestinian Feminist Collective's pledge writes, "Ours is a vision of a radically different future based on life-affirming interconnectedness, empowering the working classes, and love for each other, land, life, and the planet itself." Finally, Palestinian feminist and activist Lina Auda describes Palestinian feminism as a process of, quote, reconnecting ancestral ways of being so that we can rediscover a new sense of belonging to us, to each other, to the earth, and practice radical inclusion, belonging, and mutual interdependence, and plant seeds of values-centered liberation, healing, and steadfastness in all our communities so that we can reclaim wholeness. Collectively, these Palestinian feminists articulate a need to embrace and recognize everyday resistance that manifest as radical decolonial feminist consciousness and life-affirming practices and praxis of radical love that foreground goals of wholeness and liberation. In adapting and negotiating mystical teachings within a Palestinian context, this unique group of spiritual seekers answers the call of Sufi feminists in their offering of a nuanced approach to healing as it relates to the self/subconscious, integration of the body and spirit, one's relationship with the earth and with others around them, human and non-human. Because of its Palestinian context and female identifying majority, this community must negotiate mystical teachings with sensitivity and awareness of the Palestinian women these teachings speak to. In this vein, the mystical community takes into consideration the intersectional dimensions of Palestinian feminism and decenters the elite male normative self in its active involvement of Sufi women on the path who are sites of knowledge and divine disclosure in their own right. In addition, the mystical community's call for integration and an uplifting of self, body, and earth that must manifest as love, unity, and generosity into the world also speaks to Palestinian feminist centering of life-affirming practices and praxis of decolonial love. In fact, these mystical teachings are rooted in radical love. Maraka reminds his students that they are bound by a covenant of love, found in the Quranic verse, "He loves them and they love him," that they were created from love, that their means for self-transformation is love, and that radical love is their ultimate destination. Similarly, Maraka's teachings are purposefully life-affirming. Maraka constantly reminds his students that contrary to other spiritualities that hold an overemphasis on transcendence, we love life, we embrace life, we celebrate life. Maraka states this not as an elevation of the worldly, but as an affirmation that the pulse of life, all living beings, and the earth in all her wisdom and mercy deserve appreciation and uplifting. Next slide, please. A quick note on terminology. Arguably, the term feminist itself is a contentious one to use in Islamic studies discourse. My use of the terms Sufi feminist and Palestinian feminism are, however, intentional. Here's how I define the two. Sufi feminism, an approach to the Islamic mystical tradition which critiques and decenters the normative universal male self and patriarchal readings which denigrate the bodily, the earth, women, and the marginalized. This approach also seeds and retrieves nourishing theologies, meaning one's relationship with the divine, and religious anthropologies, meaning understandings of what it means to be human. Palestinian feminism, an intersectional, transnational, and decolonial approach to Palestinian feminism that centers life-affirming principles and praxis and imagines and embodies feminist grammar and poetics of land, life, love, and liberation towards radically different feminist futures and revolutionary world-making. First, the appeal to Sufi feminism reflects the work of Sufi-oriented feminist scholars who highlight the need for alternative readings of Sufi literature and practice that center what Ayyubi calls the male elite normative and universal self. These feminist scholars do not view feminist orientations as a departure from traditional Islamic study, but rather what Sheikh calls a friendship built on radical love and critical fidelity with tradition. I invoke the term Sufi feminism because I see the teachings of this mystical community answers the call of these Sufi feminist scholars who seek nourishing theologies and visions of the world. Maraka largely describes his teachings and community in Sufi feminist terms. Unlike other spiritualities, he notes, we value the body, the earth, and we seek the perspectives and lived experiences of our women spiritual seekers. It should also be noted that Palestinian feminists also contend with the fraught nature of the term feminism. For Palestinian feminists, feminism is not an appeal to white and colonial feminisms, but rather one that is deeply decolonial and conjoins itself to indigenous, transnational, Black, and third world feminisms as a praxis of solidarity making and coalition building. I argue that this mystical community answers the call of Palestinian feminists who highlight the need to uncover decolonial praxis of love and life affirming practice. I should also note that I see resonances with the Sufi feminist approach in a Palestinian context with womenism, particularly eco womenism, which I see as another fruitful avenue of making intentional connections and parallels for the purposes of solidarity and goals of communal recovery. Next slide. Methodology. My primary methodology for this project is ethnographic by way of interviews and participant observation. A Sufi feminist framework is utilized both as theory and praxis. This entails paying attention to both contextual and textual elements, remaining both critical and self-reflexive, and having an activist approach and orientation. Robert Rosenhall, a scholar of contemporary Sufism, recommends accounting for both embodied and discursive elements of a Sufi community in order to capture its multidimensional relevance. Both critical and feminist ethnographers advise researchers to reflect on their positionality and the ways in which certain methodologies may mischaracterize or diminish the experiences of one's interlocutors. In this case, I must be wary of both Islamophobic and Orientalist characterizations of Muslim women. Ethnographic feminist scholars of the Middle East urge scholars of the region to practice a commitment of solidarity with the struggle of their respective interlocutors, especially in a case such as Palestine. While the insider and outsider phenomenon, a part of ethnographic research, is sometimes an unuseful one in its usage of rigid binaries, I will use it here to demonstrate the fluidity in which my ethnographic positionality oscillates between the two. Admittedly, I am a member of this community and have been a spiritual seeker under Maraka's teachings for nearly 6 years. In this vein, I do have an element of insider status that allows me easy access to this community and an understanding of these teachings, mystical epistemology, and their application. While I am a member of this community and have lived among them for a period of time, I'm also an outsider. I carry privilege as a non-Palestinian and as an American. My outsider status also removes me from the indigeneity of these teachings to a certain degree. I relate this insider-outsider positionality that characterizes my role as a researcher to the Islamic and off-Sufi invoked phenomenon of the outer and the inner, the zahir and the batin. Having origins in some of the attributes of the divine, the inner and the outer often also describe the worlds of forms and signs, which often have both an inner and outer meaning. My insider status allows me to see the inner meaning of these mystical teachings and their carried value on a spiritual and metaphysical plane. On the other hand, my outsider status allows me to zoom out a bit and situate these teachings within scholarship. To this degree, my findings related to this outsider perspective and these teachings' political import are not necessarily understood as such by my interlocutors, but rather seen as everyday practice, modes of survival, and spiritual refinement. My feminist-oriented methodologies, however, urge me to consider ways in which the personal and the everyday are political. I intend to use my privilege and outsider status for solidarity making and for centering the voices and visions that emerge from this unique community. I also intend to demonstrate that Palestinian liberation is intimately bound with our own. Incidentally, a Sufi mystic and an ethnographer have much in common. Like the ethnographer, the mystic must maintain a level of reflexivity for the purposes of self-transformation. assume an epistemological posture of humility for self-purification, and operate with a degree of openness to uphold mystical epistemologies of unknowing and receptivity. A Sufi ethnographer is trained to listen and bear witness to the various signs or ayat that emerge in research in one's spiritual heart and one's the earth or the cosmic Quran desires to teach. In this vein, I find ethnographic research and the mystical path as complements to one another in a mutually reinforcing relationship, which deepen my commitments to both pursuits. Next slide, please. Situating the community. Maraka's mystical community in Hebron in the occupied West Bank practices a Sufi and Kabbalah-inspired spirituality in which the ultimate goal is to achieve unity, oneness, and a sense of comprehensivity or integration within one's being. Placed within its historical context, this community is not unlike the mystical paths that have emerged in Palestine in the past. Daphne Efrat traces the history of Sufism in Palestine from its beginnings into the present. In her account, Efrat depicts Sufism in the land that often showcased interreligious dimensions, rallying around charismatic sheikhs, adapting teachings to followers in society, and modeling acts of service and generosity. In addition, Efrat notes that many of these mystical paths were not part of traditional tariqas or Sufi orders, but simply referred to themselves as Ahl al-Tariqa, meaning people of the way. The community under study very much so follow these historical trends, as they exhibit interpath dimensions, refer to their spirituality simply as al-Tariq or the way, and extends acts of service and generosity into the world. Maraka combines his own spiritual training, studies of psychology, his lived experiences, and mystical knowledge to formulate a mysticism that speaks to his students and their social contexts and locations. This community attracts around a regular dozen members with a female majority. These students gather daily and soak up lessons from Maraka, implement them into their lives, and engage in a process of self-transformation the path readily requires. Maraka serves as a mirror to his students, a mystical concept often characteristic of teacher-disciple relationship in which the spiritual guide reveals aspects of the student's interiority for the purposes of alchemic evolution. In terms of practice, students of the community regularly engage in a journey inward that requires paid attention to one's nafs or self or subconscious, a morning meditation between wakefulness and sleep, day and night, which allows for barzakh-like blessings and unveilings, or self-awareness and actualization that emerges in the liminal and the in-between. What Sufis would call sama or remembrance and listening of sacred music, and daily practices involving reverence to the earth. Combining the teachings of prominent Sufis like Maulana Rumi, Ibn Arabi, and Al-Hallaj, along with teachings from Kabbalah and psychology, Maraka negotiates and adapts these teachings for his specific audience. For Maraka and other Sufi spiritual training, one often begins with the nafs. Next slide. Training of the nafs is a common act of refinement as a part of Sufi psychology. The nafs often translates as the self, soul, ego, or lower self. Sufi feminist scholars often note the nafs feminine grammar and how the nafs al-amara, or the evil commanding soul, is often regarded as feminine, thereby equating both women and the marginalized with the evil commanding soul. Similarly, Sufi feminist scholars like Dayton Muhammad also point out that Sufi pedagogies often treat the nafs through overly punitive measures that call for annihilation. Dayton Muhammad notes the problematic nature of such pedagogy, especially for women and those who experience structural oppression, trauma, and embodied harm, where annihilation of selfhood is ontologically harmful. Maraka's reading of the nafs as a subconscious convey a conceptualization that addresses Sufi feminist concern and critique. Because Maraka reads the nafs as the subconscious, he provides what Dayton Muhammad would call a neutral reading of the nafs, and thus redirects negative feminine readings. For Maraka, the nafs more akin to the subconscious mind, absorbs understandings of one's reality and self from its environment, intergenerational trauma, their upbringing, and even internalized oppression received through social toxins. Marika's conception of the nafs is sensitive and cognizant of the unique ongoing traumas and interlocking oppressions that impact Palestinian life that requires an understanding of their collective, colonial, and continual realities. This reading of the nafs allows the spiritual seeker to come to know oneself better through psychological understandings of self. And as one learns in Dr. Osogera's Black Muslim Psychology course, internalized oppression occurs within the subconscious and can be unlearned. In identifying these realities, students are also able to recognize such toxins and trauma that detract them from their inherent wholeness. This is not dissimilar from Yusuf Carter's findings regarding purification of the nafs in the context of transnational Black Muslim Sufis who practice Sufism between South Carolina and Senegal. For Carter, purification of the nafs refers to an eradication of the lower race-inflected self/disfigured human, and returning to one's primordial nature, which is cleansed of negative or harmful experiences. Marika's views on the nafs follows a similar trajectory. The nafs or subconscious holds reoccurring thoughts that deflect from understanding and claiming our true whole selves. Marika aligns this understanding of the self with knowledge of the divine, often quoting the hadith, "He who knows himself knows his Lord." By this measure, as one works to understand the self/subconscious and strives towards healing and wholeness, they also come to better know God. Next slide. This understanding of the nafs also influences the nature of its pedagogy. Instead of punitive pedagogies that demand annihilation or fana of the nafs, Marika uses alternative language. The nafs as a subconscious doesn't require annihilation per se, but rather a process of emptying by a self-realization that attaches one to the greater divine source. Marika refers to this act not as annihilation, but as flourishing. And though he often invokes the common hadith, "Die before you die," Marika is clear to point out this death is one in which one dies to all previous false conceptions about the self. This fana as flourishing allows one to become one with oneself, the spiritual way, with the divine and the cosmos. Fana as flourishing applies a more trauma-informed context orientation, adaptation of Sufi psychology that is also aware of each seeker's inherent wholeness. I read these teachings surrounding the nafs in the context of the military occupation, and so their colonialism in which elimination, erasure, and death are ongoing threats to Palestinian livelihood and existence. It is important to note that these threats to livelihood are often gendered. That is, they affect women, men, and queer folk in particular in distinct ways. For women, these oppressions emerge as femicide through heightened forms of patriarchy aggravated by a settler colonial context, destruction of homes which have broad consequences for women, including bodily harm, lack of security and protection, as well as lack of social support, and reproductive injustice that is exacerbated by realities of the occupation, including crippling economics, lack of healthcare, restriction of movement, and the blocking of basic resources. In addition, the invisibility of Palestinian women's plight and the often dehumanizing rhetoric associated with Palestinians further contribute to the dangers implicit in language and pedagogies that express annihilation. These realities have both physical and psychological consequences. For Palestinians to embark on a spiritual path towards wholeness and decolonial healing is a form of resistance and a political act in its own right. These strivings towards life-affirming practices of flourishing provide a powerful counter-narrative and insurgency against the violence of Israeli settler colonialism and the military occupation which pose serious threat to Palestinian wholeness. Marika often reminds his students that much of this healing is found here and now, through one's connection to Mother Earth and the recognition that they reflect the cosmic reality in their own being. Next slide, please. Marika's teachings on the earth reflect Sufi feminist elevation of the earth as a spiritual entity and further Palestinian feminist call of uplifting life-affirming practices and ways of being. For Maraka, the earth requires connection to, reverence towards, and emulation of on the spiritual path. This reading of the earth addresses Sheikh's critique of patriarchal readings, which attribute an overemphasis on transcendence, which thereby denigrates the bodily and women who are often associated with the bodily principle. Maraka's readings of the earth are like Ibn Arabi's, who views Mother Earth as the entity in which we were created and which we return to. Here, Ibn Arabi equates Mother Earth with the divine, employing the Quranic verse 2:156, which states, "To God we belong and to we return." This reading aligns with Ibn Arabi's metaphysical framework of Wahdat al-Wujud, or the oneness of being, which highlights God's immanence and humanity's intimacy with the divine, which often includes positive evaluations of materiality, of embodiment, and of women. Maraka's metaphysics follow a similar schematic framework. In urging his students to realize the God who is near, here and now, Maraka draws his students' attention to divine immanence, the earth imbued with divine spirit. As follows, Maraka regards the earth as one's first mother, one's life source, and a reflection of one's inner and outer being. These teachings of the earth elevate the realms of the bodily, the material, and the immanent. This is not a distraction from spiritual goals, but rather a required element of spirituality. As Maraka sees it, any spirituality which lacks active appreciation of the earth is missing the opportunity of experiencing the fullness, teachings, and divine mercy the earth has to offer. Maraka urges his students to bear reverence and listen to the earth's signs as an everyday life-affirming spiritual practice. One of these practices involves giving thanks or shukr to the earth, to the water one uses to cleanse their face, the flowers that energize them along a path, a calming nearby breeze. Maraka views this gratitude towards the earth as synonymous with giving divine praise. To expand, Maraka explains this expression of gratitude is not merely an act of praise, but our means of connection to both the earth and to God. In other words, one gives thanks to increase one's connectivity to a greater, merciful reality. In our connection to the earth and divine immanence, Maraka reminds his students of the many lessons they thereby receive from the earth. Like the earth, one must practice values of reciprocity, generosity, and interconnectivity. These teachings also often reflect and utilize Palestinian nature imagery as symbolic lessons. The olive tree and its oil invoke the light of the Prophet Muhammad, and the cactus represent one's patience on the spiritual path. These nature symbols become imbued with spiritual meaning and lessons. Not only do these mystical teachings provide powerful life-affirming spiritual values, they also convey Palestinians' connection to their land and earth in mystical and metaphysical forms. As these students bear reverence to the earth and express their connectivity to her, they also reinscribe their relationship with their land as indigenous stewards who understand her spiritual and life-giving dimensions and reciprocate its deserved care, respect, and nurturing. This reverence to earth and land illustrates a loving and symbiotic relationship which contrasts starkly with the violent Southern colonialism and the military occupation imposed to land and earth, which fragments the land and separates life forms from land through military checkpoints and land dispossession. Ecological devastation occurs through weapons of war, the apartheid wall, the planting of non-native plant species prone to wildfire, and settler violence. This returning to the land and the earth expressed by the community conveys an alternative vision of the land expressed through cosmic unity and interconnectivity that demand one's reciprocal relationship and reverence. Teachings of mystical unity and reciprocity disrupt biocentric and Cartesian dualities that separate humanity from the environment and inspire spiritual seekers to develop deeper metaphysical and personal connection to earth and land that reinforce our responsibility as its stewards. Not only is this eco-spiritual vision nurturing towards the earth, but it also provides nourishment and healing for the self. Next slide, please. Maraka urges his students to return to their primordial nature, a deeper connection to the earth, the divine, the cosmos. This return to our primordial nature is actually a greater connection to the pulse of life itself, the divine mercy that imbues the earth, the celestial garden of the here and now. It is a realization of the earth's beauty and one's love of both life and land that contribute to the healing of oneself. Leila Faghali, an ethnobotanist of the region, describes such a process as plancestral remembrance, a concept that regards the plants of one's indigenous homeland as living, breathing ancestors who must be remembered and sought for its medicinal properties for both body and soul. Faghali relates this concept in Sufi language. Quote, Zikr, or divine remembrance, is a prayer of return towards the ultimate oneness of the divine that exists in all life. In the ritual of zikr, healing occurs through the felt memory of oneself as inseparable from the source of life/God, which is also the umbilical of the earth. Like Faghali, Maraka urges his students to reflect on this unity of nature and the universe and to be a site of integration within one's own being. In realizing this unity and oneness within, spiritual seekers simultaneously recognize the earth as intimately connected to their healing and union with the divine. This act of healing is reminiscent of Bell Hook's description of Black peoples in the earth in Sisters of the Yam. Quote, living close to nature, Black folks were able to cultivate a spirit of wonder and reverence for life, growing food to sustain life and flowers to please the soul. They were able to make a connection with the earth that was ongoing and life-affirming. They were witnesses to beauty. Melanie Harris describes this relationality as a spiritual experience that connects being, the spirit, and the earth, and challenges the violence of white supremacy. Quite similarly, Maraka's healing of the self via the earth at once inspires spiritual seekers to reclaim their belonging to self, earth, and their primordial homeland. Next slide. To return to our metaphor of the tear gas grenade, Maraka's refashioning and transforming of these weapons of war may symbolize one's engagement with the nafs. The makeup of the nafs is altered. It is no longer a means of violence and oppression to the self, but rather one that becomes a locus for new life and defiant growth. The flower that blooms forth is like the flourishing of the nafs towards the soul. This metaphor is similar to the one of the lotus flower that emerges from mud pure and pristine. In many ways, this path towards healing is dependent on one's returning to their primordial nature and of reestablishing one's connection to earth and land. Filled with soil, the nafs discovers its rootedness in this reality and the sacrality of life and the land that nurtures them. In one's return to the earth, the self or the flower is able to receive sunlight or the divine light that unveils our true selves or our soul or ruh. Light upon light, earth upon earth, these spiritual seekers recognize the power of their own spiritual hearts and the earth for healing. As these spiritual seekers unveil their true selves and reclaim their connection to the earth, they aspire towards a liberation of their own making and efforts. In it is a recognition that life-affirming values and radical love are intrinsic to and necessary for their liberation. Such is their means of connection to each other, to life, to the divine, and to the spirit within. And it remains these seekers' largest power and greatest strength for imagining and creating alternative ways of being and feminist presence and futures against the politics of death, borders both within and without, and colonial and patriarchal logics that separate one from self, land, and communal life. This community also allows us to imagine alternative ways of being, of connecting struggles and liberations, of seeking wholeness, and above all, affirming life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We've got time for some questions. Is there anyone in the room? I can bring the mic, or you can come up here. Jeremy, is there anybody on the Zoom who might be raising their hand? Oh, here you go.
I want to say that was awesome. I want to just acknowledge the depth that you went into, and that's more there than I can pick up now. So my question has to do with insider, outsider. Is there a way to get outsiders to understand the conception of self that you have described? Because it seems to me that, we talk about the outsider looking in, not fully appreciating, not fully understanding what's there, and then comes judgment, which basically says, not good enough, different from mine is better. So if you can just, speak to how, in terms of your future aspirations, which you'll get people to understand the significance, the importance, and the value of these teachings.
Thank you, Nolan. That's a great question. I think there are some complications with that, right? That sometimes mystical epistemology isn't always understood by the masses. I'll answer your question in two ways. I think in one way, the idea of brokenness is probably universal. And I think about Maulana Rumi, and when you visit his tomb in Konya, there's a sign there that says, "Come as you are." And I think that aspect itself is universal and people can relate to. And I think the way Maraka teaches too is I think he's aware of the ways that mystical epistemology isn't for everyone. And he also studies psychology. So in that way, he's able to reach a larger audience through his teachings of psychology. So he's often preaching about these things on the radio, for instance, and he can reach a wider audience that way. And then in that way, spiritual teachings like this have, have more influence.
If there's anyone online who wants to jump on with a question as well, please feel free.
A brilliant presentation. Thank you for inviting us in. As one who is very partial to a mystical epistemology and approach, and who is part of a micro community who is thinking through these things, although in a very different location and from maybe different life stances, as I'm listening to the brilliance of your talk, I am also deeply concerned about how evil works. And there are references, there are very materially kind of focused references to evil in the talk, and you're not using that language, that's my own language. And I'm also thinking about evil in the cosmic realm. Evil is so expansive, its scope, it is so expansive. How is this community thinking about scope and scale, and given what we are confronting? A community here, a community there, deeply rooted in traditions that are thousands of years old, and tapping into the cosmos is beautiful. And also we are up against evil, massive evil. Can you talk with me, please, about how evil is a part of your thinking, even though you may use a different kind of language? How do we scale up to make the change lasting so that it sticks. Because evil seems to be sticking generation after generation after generation after generation.
Thank you, President Braxton. That's a good question. I think from a mystical standpoint, evil is something we recognize, right? As something that exists in the world. It's not something that's denied. We recognize it. We know it exists. We even know it exists within our own beings and everybody's beings. From this standpoint, I think there is this idea of needing to, in Kabbalah, it's the right over the left. So it's recognizing evil and recognizing it exists in the world, but the right goes over the evil, in some sort of unity from a cosmic perspective. In the Islamic tradition, it's similar, right? The Jamal over the Jalal. You preference the beautiful attributes of the divine over the majestic ones in harmony. They're needed in harmony. And I think that for the community, there are certain ethical teachings, right, that we're told to do and to practice, which are needed. And also recognition that we also have to have faith, that whatever is happening, that there is a grander plan. So that always that awareness. And I think there's also a belief in healing the self and being a light form in that way is powerful. Healing those things that are within ourselves, healing the evil within ourselves, and inspiring others to do the same, I think is powerful. To have people engaged in spiritual refinement in this way, I think has communal aspirations.
Hi, so much of what you presented today resonated with me personally, particularly along the lines of the methodology. And the 2 points of it being, well, from my own experience and my own life stance, what you said about ethnography and mysticism kind of saying the same thing, I think, in different languages. For me, that interprets in harm reduction in Christianity kind of that same way, to which there's an insider-outsider dynamic, that so much of this, same thing with mysticism, I think same thing with harm reduction, same thing with any sort of way that you do things that is rooted in the theory of lived experience, right? That there is wisdom that is gained from what happens to your body and the evil that is inflicted upon your body. And in a noun sense, kind of that wound opening and bringing light, but also that this knowledge, when it is widely disseminated, like with harm reduction, when it meets the state, can become watered down and diluted, and not as powerful. So I guess my question is rather in terms of like how you present this, to how does the presentation of these practices, how do you retain sort of the power that they hold, even while trying to get them, like we've kind of, like you said, and you named that the masses have a problem with mysticism. And when this meets an institution that might like what it could promise, but take it in a different way, just how is this power retained even through the presentation?
That's a great question, and I think that's something that I've been thinking about, right? And studying this community and presenting it in scholarship, there are aspects of this community that you all won't see, right? There's teachings that are probably not going to be understood, or just sort of intimate ways of being, right? That that are not for everybody, right? So seen and unseen, and thinking about these things, I wanted to convey things that I think audiences would resonate with. So I'm looking at it, I'm looking at the foundations of these teachings and then saying, okay, well, this fits here. This speaks to this sort of scholarship. This speaks to what's out there. And so in that way, it retains the foundations, but also, keeps some things private. But I think the main teaching of the unity and the integration, right, that is, that runs through a lot of traditions and this connectivity to earth, right? And I think it's so needed for our times, and that I think that can be understood across. And that's basically my hope. That's what I want to, that's what I want to come across, is that fundamental teaching.
I think we have a question on the Zoom.
That would be me. Thank you so much, Aisha, for such compelling and clear articulation around the spiritual and intellectual and communal framing for this community. My question moves in the opposite direction of Dr. Braxton. He wants to look big, and I want to look at the concrete. One of the things that Kabbalah and Sufism share is a deep investment in the world that is, and and while theorizing and developing a connection to the vastness of the cosmos, it also has very profound personal and interpersonal dimensions. So I'm wondering if you can share in ways obviously that don't violate confidentiality, but since you've been involved with the community for 6 years or more, if you can share some of the ways in which either you've seen or people have articulated, members of the community have articulated, that this thinking is shaping their praxis, shaping what they do, shaping the way they think about a particular thing that happened. You shared Mutaz Maraka's praxis with the flowers and the tear gas canisters. I'm wondering, by the way, welcome. We're so honored and delighted that Mutaz Maraka is here with us. But I'm wondering if you can share anything concrete about other members of the community and the ways that these teachings have impacted their lives in the specific.
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Mikva. So I guess my ethnographic research related to this project is very much so in its preliminary stages. So I haven't yet talked to the students of this community to gauge the direct impact in their lives. But being in this community, what I have witnessed is that Maraka very much so embodies the way service needs to be enacted in the world. And I think this knowledge that he gains through mystical experience, but also mundane experience, helps inform him of those ways that can filter out into society. And one example that is part of my dissertation study, but I didn't explore in today's talk, is the body. And I think Maraka has a very clear understanding of the body and in a Palestinian context. And one ways that he filters these teachings into society is through dance and movement therapy and somatics that he often brings to children in the West Bank, to elderly women in the West Bank, to cancer patients in the West Bank. So this is the way that he models that more practical element, and how I see that these mystical teachings, right, have practical implementation. Thank you, Dr. Mikva, for that question.
Thank you so much for this presentation and for the work that you've done. The organizer in me is like sitting on my hands for a second and then saying, yeah, this is good stuff. In so many ways, as you spoke so eloquently about communities in terms of solidarity and communal building and coalition building, I wondered and would want to know if there is, as the work that you've done, how much of that has been explored and ways in which some of this has oozed out into solidarity and movements, just thinking about the context here in Chicago, where Black and brown folks have been together on the front lines on a number of liberation movements in this city. If there are things that have oozed out that might be of use to others in coalition building.
Thank you so much for that question, Jamie, because that is something that I'm thinking about a lot and hard about. And perhaps you'll be able to help me with this when I get to work with my dissertation. But that's one of the things I want to explore. So a praxis element. So in a way, I'm going to move away from the ethnographic element a bit and have a practical application for these teachings based on my understandings of the teachings, right, as an American, and what I can do here to make those connections. So that's something I'm thinking about. I think you're right that there's so much opportunity for that. Right, we see the ways that struggles can be connected, but we also see the way pathways for healing can be connected. And I really do believe that it's when we recognize that communal aspect and work towards that, that's where our liberation is. So to answer your question, Jamie, I'm working on it. Yeah, but I would love your help with that part.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up the event. Thank you so much for your fantastic talk, and let's give one more round of applause.